The storage room door slammed shut with a thunderous crash that seemed to shake the entire basement level of Riverside Falls High School. Emma Rodriguez pressed her palms against the cold metal surface as the deadbolt clicked into place from the outside, sealing her in complete blackness. The musty smell of cleaning supplies and forgotten textbooks filled her lungs as muffled laughter echoed through the concrete walls. 3 of the most privileged students at school had just made the biggest mistake of their lives, but they had no idea that the quiet girl they'd been tormenting for months was about to turn their world upside down. What happened in the next hour would expose a web of corruption that reached from the school board to the mayor's office, and it all started because they underestimated the wrong person's granddaughter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Rodriguez had perfected the art of being invisible. At 16, she moved through the halls of Riverside Falls High School like a shadow, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing the same faded jeans and oversized hoodie that had become her uniform. Most students saw her emptying trash cans alongside her father Carlos during after-school hours and automatically categorized her as someone beneath their notice. The irony was lost on everyone that while Emma quietly mopped the floors where her classmates dropped their garbage, she was mentally cataloging every conversation, every cruel comment, and every abuse of power she witnessed in those hallways. What none of them knew was that Emma Rodriguez carried herself with the observational skills of someone raised in a law enforcement family. Her grandmother, Police Chief Margaret Rodriguez, had been unconsciously training Emma since childhood to notice details others missed, to remember faces and patterns, and to understand that real power came from patience and preparation, not loud displays of dominance. Every evening when Emma helped her father clean the school, she was actually conducting surveillance on a social ecosystem that most adults never truly understood. Riverside Falls, Colorado, nestled in a valley where the Rocky Mountains met endless plains, had once thrived as a silver mining town. Now it survived as a carefully maintained suburban community where 3 families controlled nearly everything that mattered. The Matthews family owned the largest development company in the county, responsible for the new shopping centers and luxury housing developments that had transformed the town's character. The Kim family had dominated local politics for 2 generations, with Lisa Kim serving her 3rd term as city council president. The Perry family controlled the financial sector through First National Bank, which held the mortgages on half the homes in town and the business loans that kept local commerce afloat. These weren't just wealthy families who happened to live in the same town. They were an interconnected power structure that made decisions in private country club meetings and enforced their will through carefully placed phone calls and strategic campaign contributions. Their children had grown up understanding that rules were suggestions, consequences were for other people, and their family names were get-out-of-jail-free cards that never expired. Brandon Matthews strutted through Riverside Falls High School like he owned it. And in many ways, he did. At 17, he already drove a BMW that cost more than most teachers' annual salaries and wore designer clothes that he treated as disposable. His father, Robert, had donated the money for the new gymnasium, the computer lab, and the scholarship fund that somehow always seemed to benefit students whose families did business with Matthews' development group. Brandon had inherited his father's aggressive confidence and his mother's social cunning, creating a combination that made him magnetic to some students and terrifying to others. Tyler Kim possessed a different kind of power, the subtle influence that came from understanding how systems worked. His mother Lisa didn't just serve on the city council, she essentially ran it, and Tyler had absorbed her lessons about leverage and control from an early age. He was the kind of student who never seemed to study but always earned perfect grades, not because he cheated, but because teachers understood that disappointing a Kim family member could have career implications. Tyler's power was quieter than Brandon's, but often more effective because people never saw it coming. Austin Perry rounded out the trio with old money sophistication and financial leverage that touched nearly every family in town. His father Michael controlled credit and loans, which meant he controlled dreams and futures. Austin had learned to weaponize economic anxiety with surgical precision, making casual comments about his father's concerns regarding certain families' financial stability whenever he wanted to apply pressure. He was the most dangerous of the 3, because his threats were always implicit, couched in friendly concern that left targets wondering if they'd imagined the menace. The harassment had started small, almost imperceptibly, like most campaigns designed to break someone's spirit slowly. Emma first noticed the pattern in late September, when she began finding her locker vandalized, with just enough damage to be annoying, but not enough to trigger a serious investigation. Someone would jam gum in the lock mechanism or tape obscene drawings to the inside of her locker door. Her textbooks would disappear from her desk during class, only to reappear later with pages torn or coffee stains that made them unusable. The psychological warfare escalated when they discovered how much Emma's father's job meant to her family's survival. Carlos Rodriguez had worked as head custodian at Riverside Falls High School for 15 years, ever since Emma's mother died and left him to raise their daughter alone. The job provided health insurance, steady income, and a sense of purpose that had helped him navigate single parenthood. Brandon, Tyler, and Austin began leaving messes specifically designed to humiliate Carlos, spilling drinks in areas they knew he'd have to clean, and making comments about the help loud enough for other students to hear and laugh. They started timing their harassment to coincide with Emma's most vulnerable moments. When she was rushing to class with an armload of books, one of them would accidentally bump into her, sending everything scattering across the hallway while they offered fake apologies that fooled watching teachers. During lunch, they'd occupy the table where Emma usually sat alone, forcing her to eat standing up or skip meals entirely. They'd schedule their loudest conversations about weekend parties and expensive purchases to happen right behind her in classes, making sure she understood how different her world was from theirs. The cruelty became more sophisticated as they realized Emma wouldn't fight back in traditional ways. They began spreading rumors about her family's financial struggles, questioning whether Carlos was stealing supplies from the school, and wondering aloud whether Emma got her clothes from charity donations. These weren't accusations they'd make directly to authority figures, but whispered suggestions designed to plant seeds of doubt and social isolation. By October, Emma had tried approaching the proper channels for help, but she quickly discovered how thoroughly the system was rigged in favor of families with influence. When she reported the locker vandalism to Vice Principal Walsh, he suggested she might be exaggerating normal teenage pranks and advised her to try fitting in better with her classmates. When she showed Counselor Mrs. Chen evidence of the rumors being spread about her family, she was told that she needed to develop thicker skin and focus on her studies instead of social drama. The most frustrating response came from Principal Harper, who listened to Emma's carefully documented complaints with the kind of patient condescension reserved for problems she had no intention of solving. Dr. Harper explained that the school had to be very careful about disciplinary actions that might affect students' college prospects, especially when the allegations involved misunderstandings rather than clear policy violations. She suggested that Emma focus on her own behavior and perhaps consider whether she might be misinterpreting normal social dynamics as targeted harassment. Emma realized that every adult she'd approached for help had received generous donations from the Matthews, Kim, or Perry families. The new computers in Dr. Harper's office had been funded by Matthews Development Group. Vice Principal Walsh's son had received a scholarship from the Kim Family Educational Foundation. Mrs. Chen's husband worked at First National Bank, where Austin's father controlled his career trajectory. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed to protect certain students while leaving others defenseless. The breaking point came on a cold November morning when Emma discovered that someone had broken into her father's supply closet and rearranged his carefully organized materials to make it look like he was stealing school property. Carlos had spent years developing an inventory system that maximized efficiency and minimized waste, taking pride in running the cleanest, most cost-effective custodial operation in the district. Finding his supplies scattered and labeled supplies missing was more than professional sabotage. It was an attack on his integrity and his livelihood. Emma found her father standing in the destroyed supply closet with tears in his eyes, not from sadness but from rage and helplessness. Carlos Rodriguez was a proud man who had worked multiple jobs to keep his family afloat after his wife's death, who had never asked for charity or special treatment, who had raised his daughter to believe that hard work and honesty would be rewarded. Seeing his life's work vandalized by spoiled teenagers who faced no consequences for their actions was almost more than he could bear. That evening, Emma made a decision that would change everything at Riverside Falls High School. She called her grandmother for the first time in months, not for comfort or advice, but to begin planning a response that would teach Brandon Matthews, Tyler Kim, and Austin Perry what real power looked like. Police Chief Margaret Rodriguez listened without interruption as Emma described the escalating harassment, the administrative indifference, and the morning's final insult to her father's dignity. Margaret Rodriguez had not become the first female police chief in Riverside Falls history by backing down from entitled bullies, regardless of their age or family connections. She had spent 30 years navigating the politics of a small town where money and influence often trumped justice, and she had learned that sometimes the only way to fight corruption was to document it thoroughly and then expose it all at once. When her granddaughter finished describing the systematic harassment she and her father had endured, Margaret's response was simple and chilling. "Emma, it's time these families learned that some people's granddaughters fight back." The plan they developed over the next week was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential effectiveness. Emma would continue documenting every incident of harassment while wearing a small recording device her grandmother provided. She would maintain detailed logs of administrative responses to her complaints, creating an unshakable paper trail of institutional failure. Most importantly, she would begin investigating the connections between the three families and the school administration, looking for the kind of conflicts of interest and ethical violations that could trigger state-level investigations. Margaret Rodriguez had spent decades building relationships with federal investigators, state education officials, and journalists who specialized in exposing small-town corruption. She understood that the key to defeating entrenched power was to make the cost of maintaining that power higher than the cost of surrendering it. The Matthews, Kim, and Perry families had grown comfortable in their assumption that they were untouchable, but they had never faced an opponent who understood their weaknesses better than they understood them themselves. Emma returned to school the following Monday, armed with more than just recording equipment and a documentation plan. She carried the quiet confidence of someone who finally understood that she wasn't powerless. She had simply been fighting the wrong battle. Instead of trying to fit into a system designed to exclude her, she was going to expose that system's fundamental corruption and watch it collapse under the weight of its own contradictions.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The trap was set by Emma's new understanding of her opponent's psychology. Brandon, Tyler, and Austin had escalated their harassment because they enjoyed the feeling of power it provided. But they had also grown sloppy in their confidence that no consequences would ever reach them. Emma began subtly encouraging this overconfidence by appearing more isolated and defeated than she actually felt, creating the impression that she was finally breaking under their sustained pressure. She stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria, instead spending that time in the library where she could research her tormentors' families while appearing to hide from social contact. She began responding to their comments with defeated silence instead of the quiet dignity she had maintained before, making them believe their campaign was succeeding. Most importantly, she started spending more time in areas of the school where security cameras had broken months ago and never been repaired, places where her harassers might feel safe to escalate their behavior beyond anything they had attempted before. The final provocation came on a Friday afternoon in late November when Emma deliberately timed her movement through the basement hallway to coincide with the end of basketball practice. She knew Brandon, Tyler, and Austin would be heading to the parking lot through this route, and she had spent days ensuring they would find her alone in an area where they believed no witnesses could see them. She was carrying cleaning supplies to help her father, which reinforced their perception of her as nothing more than the janitor's daughter performing menial labor. Brandon saw the opportunity first and signaled to his friends with the kind of nonverbal communication that develops between long-term co-conspirators. They had been discussing for weeks how satisfying it would be to finally break Emma's spirit completely, to reduce her to tears and begging that would prove their superiority once and for all. The basement storage room offered the perfect opportunity for the kind of intimidation that couldn't be dismissed as a misunderstanding or a prank. "Well, well, well," Brandon announced as the three boys surrounded Emma near the storage room door. "Look what we have here." The help doing her job. His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted and couldn't imagine a world where his actions would have consequences. Tyler stepped closer. using his height to loom over Emma in a way calculated to make her feel trapped and vulnerable. "You know, Emma, we've been talking, and we think there might be some confusion about your place in this school. Maybe some time alone would help you understand things better." Austin produced a key he had stolen from the administrative office earlier that week, waving it in front of Emma's face like a taunt. "Don't worry, someone will probably find you eventually. Probably your dad when he comes to clean up after us again." They grabbed Emma's arms and shoved her into the storage room with enough force to send her stumbling into the shelves of supplies, but not enough to leave marks that could be used as evidence later. Brandon slammed the door shut while Tyler turned the deadbolt lock, and Austin pocketed the key with a satisfied smile. They stood outside the door for several minutes, taking turns describing what Emma's father would think when he found his daughter locked in a closet, helpless and humiliated. What they didn't know was that Emma's grandmother had been tracking her location through a GPS device embedded in her backpack, and that every word they had spoken was being recorded by equipment far more sophisticated than anything available to civilian consumers. More importantly, they had no idea that Police Chief Margaret Rodriguez was already en route to the school with backup units and a search warrant that would transform their moment of triumph into the beginning of their complete downfall. In the darkness of the storage room, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced in months: complete calm. She wasn't trapped. She was exactly where she needed to be, with all the evidence she required to destroy her tormentor's sense of invincibility. She settled back against the shelves to wait for her grandmother's arrival, knowing that Brandon Matthews, Tyler Kim, and Austin Perry had just committed their final act of harassment at Riverside Falls High School. Emma Rodriguez had learned to read people the way her grandmother read crime scenes, methodically and without emotion. At Riverside Falls High School, she occupied a unique position that nobody else recognized. She was simultaneously invisible to her classmates and hypervisible to the adults who ran the building. Teachers saw her as Carlos Rodriguez's quiet daughter, the girl who helped empty their trash cans and never caused problems. Students saw her as part of the background, no more significant than the lockers or water fountains that lined the hallways. This dual invisibility had become Emma's greatest asset. While other students performed their teenage dramas in full view of authority figures, Emma moved through spaces where conversations happened without filters. She heard teachers complaining about administrative decisions they disagreed with but couldn't challenge publicly. She overheard students confessing to academic cheating, drug use, and family problems they would never admit to counselors. Most importantly, she witnessed the casual corruption that kept certain families immune from consequences, while destroying others for minor infractions. The Rodriguez family had deep roots in Riverside Falls that predated the arrival of the wealthy families who now controlled the town's economic and political landscape. Emma's great-grandfather had worked in the silver mines before they closed, and her grandfather had served as a police officer when the department consisted of 3 men in a single patrol car. Margaret Rodriguez had grown up understanding that real power in small towns wasn't about money or political connections. It was about knowing everyone's secrets and having the patience to use that knowledge strategically. Emma inherited this understanding along with her grandmother's gift for observation and analysis. While her classmates saw surface interactions, Emma recognized patterns of behavior that revealed character and motivation. She noticed which teachers received gifts from certain parents before grade reports came out. She observed which students could violate dress codes or skip classes without facing discipline. She documented which families' children received leadership positions, scholarships, and college recommendations regardless of their qualifications or behavior. Her academic performance reflected intelligence that her teachers consistently underestimated. Emma maintained a 3.8 GPA while working part-time jobs and helping her father with custodial duties. But guidance counselors encouraged her to consider community college or trade programs instead of 4-year universities. They spoke to her about being realistic regarding her family's financial situation and her social background, never recognizing that Emma's understanding of local power dynamics was more sophisticated than most graduate students' knowledge of their specialized fields. The irony of her situation became more apparent as Emma began documenting the harassment campaign against her family. She was simultaneously the most overlooked student at Riverside Falls High School, and the one best positioned to expose the systematic corruption that protected students like Brandon Matthews, Tyler Kim, and Austin Perry. Her access to administrative areas through her father's work, combined with her grandmother's law enforcement training, created investigative capabilities that would have impressed federal agents. Emma's relationship with her father, Carlos, provided additional layers of insight into the school's hidden power structures. Carlos had maintained his position as head custodian for 15 years by developing an encyclopedic knowledge of every adult who worked in the building. He knew which teachers were having affairs, which administrators had drinking problems, and which staff members were stealing supplies or manipulating expense accounts. This information had never been used maliciously, but it existed as a detailed catalog of human weakness and institutional failure. The father-daughter team represented something unique in Riverside Falls, a working-class family with access to information that could destabilize the entire local power structure. Carlos's position required him to be present during evening school board meetings, parent conferences, and private administrative discussions that were supposed to be confidential. Emma's presence during these events was so unremarkable that adults spoke freely around her, never considering that the janitor's daughter might be intelligent enough to understand the implications of what she heard. Margaret Rodriguez had spent 30 years preparing for a battle like the one her granddaughter now faced. As police chief, she had investigated cases involving all three of the dominant families, watching evidence disappear and witnesses change their stories whenever serious charges threatened important family members. She had learned to build ironclad cases that couldn't be dismissed through political pressure or economic leverage, and she had developed relationships with state and federal investigators who shared her frustration with small-town corruption. The recording equipment Margaret provided to Emma represented technology typically reserved for major criminal investigations. The GPS tracking, audio recording, and video capabilities were integrated into devices that looked like ordinary school supplies, creating surveillance capabilities that could document harassment and administrative failure with courtroom-quality evidence. Emma's backpack contained more sophisticated monitoring equipment than most private investigation firms possessed. More importantly, Margaret had taught Emma to think like an investigator rather than a victim. Instead of reacting emotionally to harassment, Emma learned to view each incident as data points in a larger pattern of criminal behavior. She understood that individual acts of bullying were less significant than the systematic failure of authority figures to address those acts, especially when that failure correlated with family wealth and political influence. Emma's strategic thinking developed through evening conversations with her grandmother that resembled law enforcement briefings more than typical family discussions. Margaret taught Emma to identify the difference between evidence and speculation, to document facts without emotional interpretation, and to understand how criminal cases were built through accumulation of irrefutable proof rather than dramatic confrontations. The transformation in Emma's approach to her harassment became evident in her methodical documentation of every incident. Where other students might have kept a diary of their feelings, Emma maintained investigative files that included dates, times, witnesses, and potential policy violations. She photographed vandalism before cleaning it up. She recorded conversations where threats were made. She documented administrative responses to her complaints with the precision of someone building a federal case. Her father, Carlos, initially worried that Emma's approach was too clinical, that she was suppressing normal emotional responses to sustained abuse. But Margaret helped him understand that Emma was channeling her emotions into strategic thinking that would ultimately prove more effective than tears or anger. Emma wasn't becoming cold. She was becoming dangerous to people who had assumed she was powerless. The depth of Emma's preparation became clear in her analysis of the power relationships between the Matthews, Kim, and Perry families and the Riverside Falls School administration. She had identified specific conflicts of interest that violated state ethics laws, documented financial relationships that created illegal influences on disciplinary decisions, and traced connections between family donations and administrative policy changes that should have triggered investigations. Emma discovered that Principal Harper's salary supplements came from a discretionary fund controlled by school board members who were either related to or financially dependent on the three dominant families. Vice Principal Walsh's wife worked for Matthew's development group in a position created specifically to influence his decisions regarding students from competing families. Counselor Chen's husband managed loan portfolios at First National Bank that included mortgages for most school district employees. These weren't coincidences or innocent conflicts of interest. They were carefully constructed systems of control that ensured certain families could protect their children from consequences, while using school discipline as a weapon against families who challenged their authority. Emma's documentation revealed a level of corruption that would shock state education officials and trigger federal investigations into civil rights violations. The sophistication of Emma's investigation impressed even her grandmother, who had spent decades building similar cases against organized crime networks. Emma had identified not just the obvious criminal behavior of Brandon, Tyler, and Austin, but the institutional framework that enabled and protected that behavior. She had discovered financial records, email communications, and meeting minutes that proved deliberate coordination between family wealth and administrative decision-making. Emma's understanding of her opponents extended beyond their criminal behavior to their psychological vulnerabilities. She recognized that Brandon's aggression masked deep insecurity about living up to his father's expectations. Tyler's calculated cruelty reflected anxiety about maintaining his family's political position in an increasingly diverse community. Austin's financial intimidation revealed fear that his family's traditional power was being challenged by economic changes beyond their control. This psychological insight informed Emma's strategic response to their harassment. She understood that their escalating behavior wasn't just about targeting her, it was about proving to themselves and their families that they could still exercise absolute control over their environment. Emma's apparent vulnerability made her the perfect target for teenagers who needed to feel powerful in order to cope with their own fears about the future. Part 3. The corrupt kingdom Riverside Falls operated according to unwritten rules that everyone understood but nobody discussed openly. The three families who controlled the town's economy and politics had created a system where benefits flowed upward to those with connections, while consequences flowed downward to those without protection. This hierarchy wasn't maintained through violence or obvious intimidation. It was enforced through economic pressure, social ostracism, and institutional manipulation that made resistance seem futile. The Matthews family had built their empire through strategic real estate development that transformed Riverside Falls from a declining mining town into an attractive suburban community. Robert Matthews possessed an instinct for identifying properties that would appreciate dramatically after zoning changes or infrastructure improvements that he helped orchestrate through his relationships with city planning officials. His development projects consistently received expedited approvals while competing proposals faced bureaucratic obstacles that delayed or prevented their completion. The family's influence extended beyond real estate into every aspect of community life. Matthews' development group sponsored youth sports leagues, funded community events, and provided scholarships that created dependencies throughout the social structure. Parents who criticized the company's business practices found their children excluded from teams and activities. Teachers who questioned donation-linked policy changes discovered that their contract renewals faced unexpected scrutiny. Local business owners who competed with Matthews-affiliated companies experienced inspection problems and permit delays that crippled their operations. Brandon Matthews had grown up watching his father exercise this power with casual efficiency, learning that problems were solved through phone calls to the right people rather than following official procedures. He had never faced a situation where his family name didn't open doors or eliminate obstacles, creating a worldview where other people existed primarily to facilitate his desires or stay out of his way. The Kim family's political dominance represented a different kind of power, based on understanding systems and manipulating processes, rather than owning physical assets. Lisa Kim had transformed her city council position into a platform for controlling virtually every significant decision made in Riverside Falls. She chaired committees that determined budget allocations, zoning approvals, and policy implementations that affected every resident's daily life. Lisa's political strategy relied on creating complicated regulations that most people couldn't understand, then positioning herself as the helpful public servant who could navigate those complications for constituents who supported her priorities. She sponsored legislation that appeared to benefit the general public, while including provisions that primarily advantaged her family's interests and those of their allies. Tyler Kim had absorbed his mother's lessons about political manipulation, developing skills in rhetoric and procedural maneuvering that made him formidable in student government and academic competitions. He understood how to frame arguments in ways that made opposition seem unreasonable or selfish. He could identify pressure points in institutional hierarchies and exploit them to achieve outcomes that appeared fair on the surface while serving his family's agenda. The Perry family's financial control provided the foundation that supported the other family's activities. Michael Perry had systematically acquired influence over credit, lending, and investment decisions that affected virtually every individual and business in Riverside Falls. His bank didn't just provide financial services, it functioned as an intelligence network that collected information about everyone's economic vulnerabilities and opportunities. The bank's loan approval processes considered factors beyond creditworthiness, including political loyalty, social compatibility, and willingness to support community activities that benefited the dominant families. Businesses that aligned with the Matthews-Kim Perry agenda received favorable interest rates and flexible repayment terms. Those that challenged the established order faced loan rejections, early payment demands, and credit rating problems that forced them to relocate or close entirely. Austin Perry had learned to weaponize this financial leverage with sophisticated subtlety, making threats that sounded like helpful advice and delivering ultimatums that appeared to be friendly suggestions. He could destroy someone's future with a casual comment about his father's concerns regarding their family's financial stability, creating pressure that was impossible to prove but devastating in its effectiveness. The three families' coordination wasn't formal or explicitly planned, but it operated with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed performance. When one family identified a threat or opportunity, the others provided support through their respective spheres of influence. Economic pressure from the Perrys would be reinforced by regulatory obstacles from the Kims and development complications from the Matthews, creating a comprehensive response that overwhelmed opposition before it could organize effectively. This system had operated for decades without serious challenge because it provided benefits to enough people to maintain political support while isolating and neutralizing those who suffered under its control. Teachers, police officers, and municipal employees received salary supplements and benefit enhancements that came from discretionary funds controlled by the three families. Local business owners gained access to lucrative contracts and development opportunities that depended on maintaining good relationships with the power structure. The corruption wasn't crude or obvious, it was sophisticated and systemic, creating dependencies that made resistance economically and socially costly. People who might have opposed individual decisions found themselves trapped in a web of relationships and obligations that made open dissent impossible, without risking their livelihoods and social standing. The school district represented a microcosm of this larger system, where educational policies were determined by financial considerations rather than pedagogical principles. Curriculum decisions reflected the preferences of donor families rather than educational best practices. Disciplinary policies were applied selectively based on family connections rather than consistent standards. Faculty hiring and promotion decisions considered political reliability alongside professional qualifications. Principal Harper had navigated this environment by developing a careful balance between educational leadership and political accommodation. She understood which battles she could fight and which compromises were necessary to maintain her position and protect the programs she cared about most. Her administrative decisions reflected a complex calculus that weighed educational benefits against political costs, often resulting in choices that appeared inconsistent or unfair to those who didn't understand the underlying pressures. Vice Principal Walsh had taken a different approach, embracing the system's benefits while minimizing his exposure to its ethical complications. He focused on procedural compliance and administrative efficiency, avoiding decisions that might create conflicts with influential families, while building relationships that enhanced his job security and advancement opportunities. The teaching staff understood these dynamics without discussing them openly, creating an atmosphere where professional judgment was constantly modified by political considerations. Teachers learned to adjust grades, modify disciplinary referrals, and alter recommendation letters based on subtle signals about family preferences. Those who resisted these pressures found themselves assigned to less desirable classes, excluded from leadership opportunities, and subjected to evaluation processes that threatened their career advancement. The student body reflected this adult corruption in their own social hierarchies and behavioral patterns. Students from influential families learned that rules were negotiable and consequences were avoidable through proper family connections. Students from working-class families discovered that academic excellence and exemplary behavior provided no protection against arbitrary punishment or systematic exclusion from opportunities. Emma Rodriguez had observed this system for years without fully understanding its implications until the harassment campaign forced her to analyze the institutional framework that protected her tormentors. Her documentation revealed patterns of corruption that extended far beyond individual instances of unfair treatment to encompass a comprehensive system of institutional capture that violated federal civil rights laws and state ethics regulations. The evidence Emma collected demonstrated that the Riverside Falls School District had been transformed into a private institution that served wealthy families' interests, while using public resources and claiming public educational missions. This transformation violated numerous laws designed to ensure equal educational opportunities and ethical use of taxpayer funding. Emma's investigation uncovered financial records showing that discretionary funds designated for educational programs had been redirected to projects that primarily benefited donor families. She found email communications proving that disciplinary decisions were coordinated with family representatives before being implemented. She documented meeting minutes that revealed explicit discussions about protecting certain students from consequences while targeting others for enhanced scrutiny. The scope of the corruption amazed even Emma's grandmother, who had investigated organized crime networks that operated with less coordination and efficiency than the three families controlling Riverside Falls. The evidence Emma gathered would ultimately trigger investigations by state education officials, federal civil rights agencies, and law enforcement organizations specializing in public corruption cases. But the most damaging evidence related to the systematic harassment of students whose families challenged the established power structure. Emma's documentation revealed that bullying incidents involving children from influential families were routinely dismissed or covered up, while minor infractions by students from working-class families were prosecuted with disproportionate severity. This pattern of discriminatory enforcement created a hostile educational environment that violated federal civil rights protections and state anti-bullying laws. The evidence Emma collected would ultimately result in federal intervention, court-ordered reforms, and criminal charges against multiple adults who had participated in or enabled the systematic abuse of their authority. Part 4, The Privileged Predators. Brandon Matthews entered his senior year at Riverside Falls High School with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem that his family's money and influence couldn't solve. At 17, he possessed the kind of casual arrogance that came from growing up in a world where other people existed primarily to facilitate his desires or stay out of his way. His 6-foot frame and athletic build, maintained through expensive personal training rather than school sports he considered beneath his status, commanded attention in hallways where teachers and students alike understood his family's power. The BMW X5 that Brandon drove to school each day cost more than most teachers earned in a year, but its significance extended beyond mere transportation. The vehicle served as a mobile symbol of the Matthews family's dominance, equipped with premium sound systems, custom modifications, and technology that made it more sophisticated than most adults' cars. Brandon treated the car with the casual disregard of someone who understood that damage or loss could be remedied with a phone call to his father's assistant. Brandon's academic record reflected the kind of performance that money could buy, rather than intelligence could earn. His grades remained consistently high despite sporadic attendance and minimal effort, maintained through a combination of private tutoring, donated technology, and teacher accommodation that ensured his college prospects remained bright. He had already received early admission offers from prestigious universities whose admissions offices were familiar with the Matthews family's generous alumni giving and potential for future donations. The psychological profile that emerged from Emma's careful observation revealed someone whose aggression masked deep insecurity about his own capabilities and worth. Brandon had grown up in a family where achievement was measured by power exercised over others, rather than personal accomplishment or contribution to community welfare. His father, Robert, demonstrated love through financial gifts and problem-solving phone calls rather than emotional connection or moral guidance. Brandon's relationship with authority figures reflected his family's approach to institutional control rather than respect or cooperation. He had learned to view teachers, administrators, and even police officers as service providers whose job was to accommodate his needs rather than enforce rules or maintain standards. When conflicts arose, Brandon's first instinct was to escalate pressure through family connections rather than modify his behavior or accept consequences. Tyler Kim represented a more sophisticated form of entitlement, based on political understanding rather than economic domination. His mother Lisa had taught him to view every interaction as a negotiation, where the goal was controlling outcomes through strategic manipulation rather than honest communication. Tyler had absorbed lessons about power that most adults never mastered, developing skills in rhetoric, procedure, and psychological pressure that made him formidable, despite his physical unremarkability. Tyler's academic excellence was genuine rather than purchased, but it was directed toward acquiring influence rather than knowledge or personal growth. He excelled in debate competitions, student government, and academic contests that provided platforms for demonstrating superiority over classmates whose families lacked political connections. His intelligence was real and impressive, but it had been shaped by family values that prioritized winning over fairness and control over collaboration. The Kim family's political success had taught Tyler that public perception mattered more than private reality, and that skilled rhetoric could transform any situation to his advantage. He had learned to frame arguments in ways that made opposition seem unreasonable or selfish, identifying pressure points in institutional hierarchies and exploiting them to achieve outcomes that appeared fair while serving his family's agenda. Tyler's psychological makeup reflected someone who had learned to view other people as variables in political equations rather than individuals with inherent worth and rights. His cruelty toward Emma wasn't driven by personal animosity, but by strategic calculation designed to demonstrate his family's continued dominance over challenges to the established order. He understood that allowing working-class families to resist harassment would create precedents that could threaten the system his family had spent generations building. Austin Perry completed the triumvirate with financial sophistication that made him the most dangerous of the three despite his quiet demeanor and unremarkable appearance. His father Michael had taught him to understand money as a form of power that could be applied with surgical precision to achieve outcomes that crude intimidation or political maneuvering couldn't accomplish. Austin had learned to weaponize economic anxiety with threats that sounded like helpful advice and ultimatums that appeared to be friendly suggestions. The Perry family's banking empire provided Austin with detailed knowledge about every family's financial vulnerabilities and dependencies. He knew which parents were struggling with mortgage payments, which students relied on financial aid for college prospects, and which teachers had taken loans that created obligations to his family's institution. This information gave Austin leverage that was impossible to prove but devastating in its effectiveness. Austin's cruelty was the most calculating of the three, because it was based on comprehensive understanding of his victims' economic fears rather than simple desire for dominance or political control. He could destroy someone's future with a casual comment about his father's concerns regarding their family's financial stability, creating pressure that appeared to be market-based rather than personally motivated. The three boys had developed their partnership through years of coordinated action that reflected their family's broader alliance. They understood each other's strengths and limitations, creating a division of labor that maximized their combined effectiveness while minimizing individual exposure to consequences. Brandon provided physical intimidation and social dominance, Tyler contributed political manipulation and institutional knowledge, and Austin delivered economic pressure and strategic intelligence. Their approach to harassment had evolved through experimentation and success, developing techniques that caused maximum psychological damage while remaining below the threshold that would trigger serious administrative intervention. They had learned to coordinate their attacks to create cumulative pressure that was more devastating than individual incidents, timing their actions to exploit moments when their victims were most vulnerable and least likely to receive support. The campaign against Emma Rodriguez represented the culmination of their collaborative cruelty, designed to demonstrate their continued immunity from consequences while sending a message to other working-class families about the cost of challenging the established order. They had correctly identified Emma as a symbolic target whose humiliation would reinforce their dominance, while providing personal satisfaction and entertainment. What they had failed to recognize was that Emma represented something they had never encountered before: a victim with resources, intelligence, and connections that matched or exceeded their own. Their confidence in their immunity from consequences was based on experience with opponents who lacked the sophistication and determination necessary to challenge their power effectively. The psychological profiles Emma developed of her tormentors revealed individuals whose sense of self-worth depended entirely on their ability to control and dominate others. They had never learned to derive satisfaction from personal achievement, meaningful relationships, or contribution to community welfare. Their identities were constructed around power over others, rather than internal sources of confidence and purpose. This psychological dependency made them simultaneously more dangerous and more vulnerable than typical bullies. They were more dangerous because their need for dominance drove them to escalate harassment beyond normal limits when their authority was challenged. They were more vulnerable because their self-concept collapsed when their power was effectively challenged or removed. Emma's strategic response was designed to exploit these psychological vulnerabilities while gathering evidence that would ensure legal and institutional consequences for their behavior. She understood that defeating them required more than just stopping their harassment. It required dismantling the system that had created and protected them while providing them with new understanding about the limits of their power. The depth of their cruelty became apparent in Emma's documentation of harassment incidents that extended beyond her own victimization to include systematic targeting of other students whose families lacked influence or protection. They had spent years refining techniques for psychological manipulation that caused lasting damage while avoiding detection by adults who might intervene on behalf of their victims. Their harassment campaigns typically began with social isolation, designed to cut victims off from potential sources of support and encouragement. They would spread rumors, manipulate social media, and coordinate exclusion from activities until their targets became friendless and desperate for acceptance. Once isolation was achieved, they would offer conditional friendship that required humiliating submission to their authority and participation in targeting other vulnerable students. The pattern of escalation they employed with Emma followed this established template, but with additional elements designed to exploit her family's economic vulnerability and social position. They understood that attacking her father's employment would create stress that extended beyond typical teenage harassment into adult survival fears that could destabilize her entire family structure. Their fatal mistake was assuming that Emma's apparent powerlessness reflected actual helplessness rather than strategic patience. They had encountered resistance before, but always from families whose resources and connections were inferior to their own. Emma represented their first encounter with an opponent whose capabilities exceeded their own, disguised by circumstances that made her appear vulnerable and isolated. The evidence Emma gathered revealed criminal behavior that extended beyond bullying into areas of conspiracy, criminal harassment, and civil rights violations that would ultimately result in adult criminal charges despite their status as minors. Their family's influence, which had always provided protection from consequences, would prove inadequate against federal investigators and state prosecutors who specialized in cases involving institutional corruption and systematic abuse of power. Part 5. The Systematic Campaign. The harassment escalated with the methodical precision of a military campaign, each incident designed to build upon previous psychological damage while maintaining plausible deniability that had protected Brandon, Tyler, and Austin throughout their academic careers. Emma's documentation revealed patterns of behavior that demonstrated not spontaneous teenage cruelty, but calculated psychological warfare designed to destroy her sense of safety, belonging, and hope for the future. The campaign's sophistication became apparent in its multi-layered approach that attacked different aspects of Emma's life simultaneously. Social media harassment created digital evidence of her isolation and humiliation that followed her beyond school grounds. Physical intimidation in hallways and classrooms made her feel unsafe in spaces where she was supposed to be protected. Academic sabotage threatened her future college prospects and scholarship opportunities. Economic targeting of her father's employment created family stress that amplified every other form of abuse. Brandon initiated each escalation phase with physical confrontations that established his dominance while providing psychological cover for the more subtle attacks that followed. His approach relied on using his size, athleticism, and social status to create fear that made Emma's other tormentors seem reasonable by comparison. He would corner her in hallways, block her path to classes, or stand intimidatingly close during conversations that were technically within acceptable boundaries but psychologically overwhelming. The physical harassment followed patterns that Emma's grandmother recognized from domestic violence cases, designed to establish control through unpredictable threats, rather than consistent violence that might trigger institutional intervention. Brandon would alternate between aggressive confrontation and casual indifference, creating anxiety about when the next incident might occur and what form it would take. Tyler's contributions to the campaign demonstrated the political manipulation skills his family had used to control Riverside Falls for decades. He specialized in bureaucratic harassment that used institutional processes as weapons against Emma's academic and social standing. Tyler would file anonymous complaints about Emma's behavior that triggered administrative investigations requiring her to defend herself against fabricated charges. The administrative harassment created a paper trail that made Emma appear problematic to teachers and counselors who didn't understand the coordination behind the complaints. Tyler understood how to manipulate school policies and procedures to create maximum disruption with minimal risk to himself, using his knowledge of bureaucratic systems to transform Emma's academic experience into a series of defensive responses to false accusations. Tyler's psychological warfare extended to manipulation of classroom dynamics that isolated Emma from potential sources of support among her peers. He would ask pointed questions during class discussions that highlighted Emma's economic disadvantages, make comments that positioned her as an outsider, or volunteer information about social events and opportunities that excluded students from working-class families. Austin's role in the campaign represented the most insidious form of harassment because it attacked Emma's family's economic security and future prospects. His father's banking connections provided Austin with detailed knowledge about the Rodriguez family's financial situation, including mortgage payments, credit history, and employment dependencies that created leverage for sophisticated extortion. Austin would make casual comments about economic trends that might affect custodial jobs, mention his father's concerns about certain families' financial stability, or discuss college costs in ways that highlighted Emma's limited options compared to his unlimited resources. These comments appeared to be normal teenage conversation but carried implicit threats about economic retaliation that could destroy her family's stability. The financial intimidation created stress that extended beyond Emma to affect her father, Carlos, who began experiencing anxiety about job security that interfered with his work performance and health. Austin understood that attacking family stability would amplify every other form of harassment by creating survival fears that made resistance seem impossibly costly. The coordination between the three tormentors demonstrated planning and communication that elevated their behavior from bullying to criminal conspiracy. Emma's recordings captured conversations where they discussed timing, target selection, and response strategies that revealed sophisticated understanding of institutional vulnerabilities and legal boundaries. Their planning sessions revealed individuals who had studied their environment with the precision of intelligence operatives, identifying security camera blind spots, administrative response patterns, and social dynamics that could be exploited to maximize damage while minimizing consequences. They had developed techniques for coordinating harassment across multiple platforms and locations that created cumulative pressure exceeding the sum of individual incidents. The psychological impact of their campaign was measured and documented by Emma with clinical precision that impressed her grandmother's law enforcement colleagues. Emma's journals revealed someone experiencing symptoms of chronic stress, sleep disruption, and hypervigilance that were consistent with victims of systematic persecution. The harassment had created measurable impacts on her academic performance, social relationships, and physical health that would provide evidence of damages in eventual legal proceedings. The escalation patterns Emma documented revealed increasingly desperate attempts to provoke responses that could be used to justify administrative punishment or social ostracism. When Emma failed to react with the anger or desperation they expected, Brandon, Tyler, and Austin began taking greater risks and employing more obvious harassment techniques that created the evidence necessary for their eventual prosecution. Their overconfidence led them to document their own criminal behavior through text messages, social media posts, and recorded conversations that provided prosecutors with ironclad evidence of conspiracy and premeditation. Emma's careful documentation strategy ensured that every communication and incident was preserved with metadata that would satisfy courtroom evidence standards. The systematic nature of the harassment became clear in Emma's analysis of timing patterns that revealed coordination with family business cycles, political events, and administrative schedules. The attacks intensified during periods when school oversight was reduced, when Emma's father faced increased work pressure, or when community attention was focused on other issues that provided cover for escalated abuse. Emma's grandmother recognized the harassment patterns from organized crime cases she had investigated, where systematic intimidation was used to control communities and eliminate opposition to criminal enterprises. The sophistication of the campaign suggested adult guidance, or at least institutional tolerance, that extended beyond normal teenage misbehavior into areas of criminal conspiracy and civil rights violations. The evidence Emma collected revealed harassment that violated federal anti-bullying laws, state criminal statutes, and school district policies in ways that created liability for every adult who had failed to intervene, despite clear documentation of systematic abuse. The institutional failure to protect Emma, despite overwhelming evidence of harassment, would ultimately trigger federal civil rights investigations and court-ordered reforms. The campaign's ultimate goal became apparent in recorded conversations where Brandon, Tyler, and Austin discussed their intention to force Emma's family to leave Riverside Falls entirely. They viewed her presence as a challenge to their authority that required elimination rather than management. revealing the totalitarian mindset that had been fostered by their family's control over community institutions. Their planning for the final escalation that led to Emma's imprisonment in the storage room demonstrated criminal intent that extended beyond harassment into areas of false imprisonment, criminal conspiracy, and possibly kidnapping under state law. The evidence Emma gathered would provide prosecutors with multiple charging options that could result in adult criminal convictions, despite the perpetrator's status as minors. The systematic documentation Emma maintained throughout the harassment campaign created a legal case file that impressed federal investigators and state prosecutors who specialized in hate crime and civil rights violations. Her evidence collection demonstrated the kind of thoroughness and professionalism that most law enforcement agencies struggled to achieve in complex cases involving institutional corruption and systematic abuse of power. The campaign's scope and sophistication ultimately provided Emma with advantages her tormentors never anticipated. Their belief in their own immunity from consequences led them to create extensive evidence of criminal behavior that would be impossible to dismiss through family influence or political pressure. They had documented their own guilt with precision that made prosecution inevitable once their victims gained access to competent legal representation and law enforcement support. The November morning that would change everything at Riverside Falls High School began with Emma discovering her father's supply closet had been transformed into a scene of deliberate chaos. Carlos Rodriguez stood in the doorway of his meticulously organized workspace, staring at cleaning supplies scattered across the floor, inventory sheets torn and scattered, and chemical containers opened and spilled to create toxic fumes that would require professional cleanup. 20 years of careful organization and professional pride lay destroyed in what appeared to be random vandalism, but was actually a calculated assault on his dignity and livelihood. Emma found her father standing motionless among the destruction, his hands clenched at his sides as he surveyed damage that represented far more than inconvenience or expense. Carlos had built his reputation on maintaining the cleanest, most efficiently managed custodial operation in the school district, taking pride in systems that maximized effectiveness while minimizing waste. The vandalized supply closet represented an attack on his professional identity and family's economic security that cut deeper than any personal insult could have achieved. The psychological impact of the destruction was amplified by its obvious intentionality. This wasn't random teenage mischief or accidental damage that might occur during normal school activities. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating maximum chaos, while ensuring the scene would appear to implicate Carlos in theft or mismanagement. Expensive supplies were missing entirely, while cheap items were damaged beyond use, creating inventory discrepancies that would trigger administrative investigations and potential criminal charges. Emma recognized immediately that the supply closet vandalism represented escalation beyond psychological harassment into criminal territory that could destroy her father's career and her family's financial stability. The perpetrators had crossed lines that would trigger responses from law enforcement and school district security that couldn't be dismissed through family influence or political pressure. More importantly, they had provided Emma with evidence of criminal behavior that would justify the coordinated response she and her grandmother had been planning. The timing of the vandalism coincided perfectly with Emma's strategic preparation for documenting harassment that had reached intolerable levels requiring decisive intervention. Her recording equipment was fully operational, her evidence files were comprehensive and legally admissible, and her grandmother's law enforcement contacts were prepared to respond immediately when criminal behavior was documented with sufficient clarity to ensure successful prosecution. Emma's response to discovering the vandalized supply closet demonstrated the strategic thinking that had been developed through months of careful preparation and training from her grandmother. Instead of reacting emotionally or reporting the incident through normal administrative channels that had proven unreliable, Emma began documenting evidence with forensic precision, while comforting her father and explaining how the destruction would ultimately serve their cause rather than destroy their lives. The evidence collection process Emma initiated in the vandalized supply closet reflected law enforcement training that surpassed the capabilities of most school district security personnel. She photographed damage patterns that revealed multiple perpetrators working with specific goals rather than random destruction. She collected fingerprints from surfaces that had been handled during the vandalism using techniques her grandmother had taught her. She documented missing inventory that could be traced through purchase records and security footage that covered supply deliveries and storage access. Most importantly, Emma recognized that the vandalism represented overconfidence by her tormentors that would lead them to make additional mistakes that could be documented and prosecuted. The destruction of her father's supply closet was intended to intimidate and humiliate the Rodriguez family into submission, but it actually provided the catalyst for exposing criminal behavior that extended far beyond individual harassment into institutional corruption that violated federal civil rights laws. The administrative response to the supply closet vandalism revealed the depth of corruption that protected certain students while exposing others to prosecution for minor infractions. Principal Harper's initial reaction focused on investigating Carlos's inventory management procedures rather than treating the incident as criminal destruction of property requiring police intervention. Vice Principal Walsh suggested that the vandalism might have resulted from Carlos's failure to secure the supply area properly, implying that the victim was responsible for creating opportunities for theft and damage. Emma's documentation of administrative responses to the vandalism provided additional evidence of institutional bias that discriminated against working-class families while protecting wealthy students from consequences for serious criminal behavior. The school's failure to treat obvious criminal damage as a police matter while investigating the victim's professional competence revealed systematic corruption that violated federal equal protection guarantees and state anti-discrimination laws. The psychological impact of the supply closet vandalism extended beyond Carlos to affect Emma's determination to expose the comprehensive criminal enterprise that had targeted her family. Watching her father struggle with professional humiliation and economic anxiety, while school administrators blamed him for becoming a victim, crystallized Emma's understanding that justice would never be achieved through normal institutional processes that were designed to protect perpetrators rather than punish criminal behavior. Emma's strategic response to the vandalism incorporated lessons learned from studying her grandmother's most successful prosecutions of organized crime networks that had seemed untouchable due to political connections and economic influence. The key to defeating entrenched corruption was building comprehensive cases that exposed systematic criminal behavior, rather than focusing on individual incidents that could be dismissed as misunderstandings or disciplinary matters. The supply closet vandalism provided Emma with the final piece of evidence necessary to trigger the coordinated law enforcement response that would transform her harassment case into a federal investigation of institutional corruption and civil rights violations. Her documentation revealed criminal conspiracy that extended beyond teenage bullying into areas of organized criminal activity that threatened the safety and constitutional rights of multiple victims across several years of systematic abuse. The escalation represented by the supply closet vandalism demonstrated that Brandon, Tyler, and Austin had moved beyond harassment into criminal territory that would expose them to adult prosecution regardless of their age or family connections. Their belief in their immunity from consequences had led them to commit felonies that could not be dismissed through administrative discipline or family influence with local officials who lacked jurisdiction over federal civil rights violations. Emma's father, Carlos, experienced the vandalism as both personal violation and professional catastrophe that threatened everything he had worked to build since his wife's death 15 years earlier. The custodial job represented more than employment. It provided identity, purpose, and community connection that had sustained him through single parenthood and economic hardship. The attack on his professional competence and integrity struck at the foundation of his self-worth and family stability. The emotional impact of watching her father suffer humiliation and anxiety while school administrators implied he was responsible for his own victimization motivated Emma to accelerate plans for exposing the criminal network that had operated with impunity for years. She understood that defeating her tormentors required more than stopping their harassment. It required dismantling the institutional structure that had created and protected them while ensuring they faced consequences that would deter future criminal behavior. The vandalism also revealed the perpetrators' understanding that attacking family economic security represented the most effective form of intimidation available to them. They recognized that threatening Carlos's employment would create survival fears that amplified every other form of harassment by making resistance seem prohibitively expensive. Their calculation was accurate, but incomplete, because they failed to account for Emma's access to resources that matched or exceeded their own family's influence and connections. Emma's strategic response to the supply closet vandalism incorporated her grandmother's advice about timing and evidence that would maximize impact while ensuring successful prosecution. The incident provided justification for immediate law enforcement intervention that could protect her family while gathering additional evidence of criminal conspiracy that extended beyond individual harassment into institutional corruption, requiring federal investigation and court-ordered remediation. The vandalism represented a turning point where Emma transitioned from defensive documentation to offensive action that would expose the full scope of criminal behavior that had been protected by local corruption for decades. Her evidence collection shifted from gathering proof of harassment to building comprehensive cases that would result in criminal convictions, civil rights remediation, and institutional reforms that would protect future victims from systematic abuse. Part 7. The Final Catalyst. The confrontation that would forever alter the power dynamics at Riverside Falls High School was orchestrated by Emma with the precision of a federal sting operation. 3 days after discovering her father's vandalized supply closet, Emma had positioned herself perfectly to document the final escalation that would provide irrefutable evidence of criminal conspiracy, while demonstrating her tormentor's complete disregard for legal boundaries and institutional authority. Emma's strategic positioning on the Friday afternoon when everything changed reflected weeks of careful observation and planning that would have impressed seasoned investigators. She had identified the basement hallway near the gymnasium as the perfect location for the final confrontation because its isolation provided privacy for criminal behavior, while its acoustic properties would ensure perfect audio recording of conversations and threats. The area's broken security cameras had never been repaired, creating the illusion of safety for perpetrators while providing Emma with controlled conditions for evidence gathering. The timing of Emma's presence in the target area was carefully calculated to coincide with the end of basketball practice, when Brandon, Tyler, and Austin would be moving through the basement hallway toward the student parking lot. Emma's apparent vulnerability in the isolated location would trigger their predatory instincts, while providing her with the opportunity to document escalated harassment that crossed legal thresholds, requiring immediate law enforcement intervention. Emma's preparation for the final confrontation included coordination with her grandmother that ensured rapid response capabilities while maintaining the appearance of accidental encounter that would preserve the authenticity of evidence collected during the incident. Police Chief Margaret Rodriguez had positioned backup units within minutes of the school while maintaining communication protocols that would document everything transpiring in real time through Emma's sophisticated recording equipment. The psychological preparation Emma underwent for the confrontation demonstrated maturity and strategic thinking that exceeded most adults' capabilities when facing systematic intimidation and threats. She had mentally rehearsed multiple scenarios for how the encounter might develop, preparing responses that would encourage her tormentors to reveal their criminal intentions while avoiding provocation that might compromise the legal admissibility of evidence collected during their conversation. Emma's emotional state during the final confrontation reflected the calm confidence of someone who understood that apparent vulnerability masked overwhelming advantages in resources, preparation, and legal authority. She was no longer the powerless victim her tormentors believed they were attacking, but rather a trained investigator gathering evidence that would ensure their criminal behavior faced appropriate consequences through law enforcement and judicial processes they could not influence or control. The moment when Brandon, Tyler, and Austin encountered Emma in the basement hallway represented the culmination of months of escalating harassment that had provided them with false confidence in their immunity from consequences. Their approach to the confrontation revealed individuals who had become intoxicated by their own power and convinced that their family connections provided absolute protection from any challenges to their authority or behavior. Brendan's initial verbal assault demonstrated the same physical intimidation tactics he had employed throughout the harassment campaign, but with increased intensity that reflected his frustration with Emma's failure to submit to their authority or flee from their persecution. His threats became more explicit and personal, revealing criminal intent that extended beyond harassment into areas of assault and false imprisonment that would trigger felony charges regardless of his age or family connections. Tyler's contributions to the confrontation showcased the political manipulation skills that had made him effective in previous harassment scenarios, but his overconfidence led him to articulate plans and motivations that provided prosecutors with clear evidence of premeditation and conspiracy. His recorded statements revealed sophisticated understanding of the psychological impact their harassment was designed to achieve, demonstrating criminal intent that could not be dismissed as teenage mischief or misunderstanding. Austin's role in the final confrontation involved the same financial intimidation tactics he had perfected throughout the harassment campaign, but escalated to include explicit threats against Emma's family's economic security that constituted criminal extortion under state law. His recorded statements about his father's ability to destroy the Rodriguez family's financial stability provided evidence of conspiracy that extended beyond individual harassment to include adult participation in criminal activity. The coordination between the three perpetrators during the final confrontation revealed planning and communication that elevated their behavior from bullying to criminal conspiracy requiring prosecution under federal civil rights statutes. Their recorded discussion of previous harassment incidents provided evidence of ongoing criminal enterprise that had targeted multiple victims over extended periods while being protected by institutional corruption. Emma's responses during the confrontation demonstrated the strategic communication skills her grandmother had taught her for managing dangerous situations while gathering evidence that would ensure successful prosecution. She avoided provocation while encouraging her tormentors to articulate their intentions and motivations, creating recordings that would provide prosecutors with overwhelming evidence of criminal behavior and premeditation. The escalation toward physical confrontation represented the moment when Brandon, Tyler, and Austin committed felonies that could not be dismissed through family influence or administrative discipline. Their decision to physically force Emma into the storage room transformed harassment into false imprisonment and assault charges that would trigger adult prosecution, regardless of their status as minors or their family's political connections. The psychological dynamics revealed during the confrontation demonstrated perpetrators whose sense of entitlement and immunity from consequences had led them to commit increasingly serious crimes while documenting their own criminal behavior through statements and actions that provided prosecutors with ironclad evidence of guilt. Their overconfidence became their greatest vulnerability, as they incriminated themselves while believing they were demonstrating their power and authority. Emma's experience during the confrontation reflected the transformation from victim to investigator that had occurred through months of careful preparation and strategic thinking. She was no longer reacting defensively to harassment, but actively gathering evidence that would ensure justice while protecting herself and others from future victimization by the same perpetrators. The moment when the storage room door slammed shut marked the end of Brandon, Tyler, and Austin's immunity from consequences, and the beginning of a criminal investigation that would expose institutional corruption extending far beyond individual harassment to encompass systematic civil rights violations requiring federal intervention and court-ordered reforms. Emma's calm response to being imprisoned in the storage room demonstrated confidence in her preparation, and her understanding that the apparent victory her tormentors were celebrating was actually their final criminal act before facing prosecution that would destroy their sense of immunity and privilege forever. She understood that justice was finally within reach, not through institutional processes that had failed her family, but through law enforcement intervention that would hold criminal behavior accountable regardless of family wealth or political influence. The evidence collected during the final confrontation would ultimately provide the foundation for criminal prosecutions, civil rights litigation, and institutional reforms that would transform Riverside Falls High School from a corrupt institution that protected wealthy perpetrators into an educational environment that ensured equal protection and opportunity for all students regardless of their family's economic or social status. Part 8. Strategic Preparation. The week following the supply closet vandalism transformed Emma Rodriguez from a victim documenting harassment into a federal informant, building a criminal case that would dismantle corruption throughout Riverside Falls. Her grandmother's law enforcement contacts had reviewed Emma's evidence files and determined that the systematic harassment represented civil rights violations requiring investigation by federal agencies with jurisdiction over institutional corruption and discriminatory enforcement of educational policies. Emma's preparation for the final confrontation involved coordination with FBI investigators who specialized in cases involving public corruption and civil rights violations in educational institutions. The recording equipment she carried was upgraded to law enforcement standards that would ensure admissibility in federal court proceedings, while GPS tracking and emergency communication systems provided real-time monitoring of her safety during high-risk evidence-gathering operations. The strategic planning sessions between Emma and her grandmother resembled briefings for undercover operations targeting organized crime networks, with detailed analysis of perpetrator psychology, institutional vulnerabilities, and legal requirements for building prosecutable cases. Emma learned to think like a federal investigator rather than a high school student, understanding that successful prosecution required comprehensive evidence of criminal conspiracy, rather than documentation of individual harassment incidents. Margaret Rodriguez's 30 years of law enforcement experience provided Emma with sophisticated understanding of how criminal networks operated and how they could be dismantled through patient evidence gathering and strategic timing of interventions. The police chief had successfully prosecuted cases involving wealthy families who believed their money and political connections provided immunity from consequences, and she understood exactly how to build cases that couldn't be dismissed through influence or intimidation. The federal investigation that Emma's evidence had triggered represented the first serious challenge to the Matthews-Kim Perry power structure in decades, with implications that extended far beyond high school harassment to encompass municipal corruption, civil rights violations, and possibly organized crime activity that had operated under protection of local political influence. Emma's harassment case had opened investigative doors that would expose criminal behavior throughout Riverside Falls' power structure. Emma's role as a cooperating witness in the federal investigation required her to maintain her cover as an apparently powerless victim while gathering evidence that would ensure successful prosecution of not only her direct tormentors, but also the adults who had enabled and protected their criminal behavior. The sophisticated nature of her assignment would have challenged experienced law enforcement officers, but Emma's unique position and training made her ideally suited for the operation. The evidence collection protocols Emma followed during her final weeks of harassment documentation reflected federal investigative standards that ensured admissibility in court proceedings while protecting her safety and maintaining operational security. Every conversation was recorded with equipment that provided backup systems and metadata verification. Every incident was documented with photographic evidence and witness statements that could withstand defense attorney challenges. Emma's psychological preparation for confronting systematic intimidation and threats involved training that helped her manage stress and fear while maintaining focus on evidence-gathering objectives that served larger justice goals. She learned to compartmentalize emotional responses to harassment while remaining alert to opportunities for documenting criminal behavior that could protect future victims from similar persecution. The coordination between Emma's evidence gathering and federal investigation created a comprehensive approach to exposing corruption that had protected criminal behavior for decades, while denying constitutional rights to working-class families who lacked political influence or economic leverage. Emma's harassment case became the foundation for investigating systematic civil rights violations that affected multiple victims across several years of institutional failure. Emma's understanding of her strategic role in the federal investigation motivated her to accept risks and endure continued harassment that would have overwhelmed victims who lacked access to law enforcement support and protection. She recognized that her suffering served purposes beyond personal justice to include exposing systematic corruption that threatened democratic institutions and constitutional protections throughout the community. The federal investigators' assessment of Emma's evidence files revealed criminal activity that exceeded their initial expectations, with documentation of conspiracy, civil rights violations, and institutional corruption that warranted investigation by multiple agencies with different areas of expertise and jurisdiction. Emma's careful documentation had provided the foundation for cases that could result in federal convictions and court-ordered institutional reforms. Emma's preparation for the final confrontation included contingency planning for multiple scenarios that might develop during evidence-gathering operations, with backup communication systems and emergency response protocols that ensured her safety while maximizing opportunities for documenting criminal behavior that would ensure successful prosecution of all participants in the harassment conspiracy. The sophisticated nature of Emma's investigative role required her to balance competing objectives of maintaining her cover while gathering evidence, protecting her safety while accepting calculated risks, and serving justice while managing personal trauma that resulted from prolonged exposure to systematic intimidation and threats. Her performance exceeded professional standards that would have challenged experienced law enforcement officers. Emma's strategic thinking during the preparation phase demonstrated intellectual capabilities that impressed federal investigators, who specialized in complex cases involving institutional corruption and organized criminal activity. Her analysis of perpetrator psychology, institutional vulnerabilities, and legal requirements for prosecution revealed understanding that surpassed most adults' comprehension of criminal justice processes and constitutional law. The federal investigation that Emma's evidence had initiated represented a comprehensive response to systematic civil rights violations that had operated under protection of local corruption for decades, with implications for educational policy, municipal governance, and law enforcement practices throughout Colorado's smaller communities, where wealthy families exercise disproportionate political influence. Emma's final week of evidence gathering involved accepting increased personal risk while maintaining operational discipline that ensured the admissibility and comprehensiveness of evidence that would support criminal prosecutions, civil rights litigation, and institutional reforms designed to prevent future systematic harassment of students from working-class families who lacked political protection or economic leverage. Part 9. The Perfect Trap. The storage room that would become the scene of Brandon, Tyler, and Austin's final criminal act had been selected by Emma, with the same strategic precision that federal agents used when setting up surveillance operations against organized crime targets. Located in the basement level of Riverside Falls High School, the room provided acoustic isolation that would ensure perfect audio recording while creating the psychological pressure that would encourage her tormentors to reveal their criminal intentions without considering the legal consequences of their statements and actions. Emma's positioning in the basement hallway on the afternoon of the final confrontation was the result of careful observation and planning that had identified the exact timing and location where her tormentors' predatory instincts would overcome their caution, leading them to commit felonies while believing they were demonstrating their power and immunity from consequences. The isolated location gave them confidence to escalate beyond harassment into criminal territory that would trigger adult prosecution regardless of their age or family connections. The psychological trap Emma had created was based on her understanding of the perpetrator's need to prove their dominance through increasingly extreme acts of intimidation and control. Their frustration with her failure to submit to their authority or flee from their persecution had motivated them to plan the kind of dramatic confrontation that would either break her spirit completely or provide her with irrefutable evidence of criminal behavior that could not be dismissed through family influence or administrative corruption. Emma's calm demeanor during the approach to the final confrontation reflected her understanding that apparent vulnerability masked overwhelming advantages in preparation, resources, and legal authority that her tormentors could never have anticipated. She was no longer the powerless victim they believed they were attacking, but rather a trained investigator whose evidence gathering would ensure their criminal behavior faced appropriate consequences through law enforcement and judicial processes they could not influence or control. The recording equipment Emma carried during the final confrontation represented technology typically reserved for federal investigations of organized crime networks, with audio quality that would satisfy courtroom evidence standards and GPS tracking that provided real-time location monitoring for backup units positioned by her grandmother throughout the area surrounding the school. Every word spoken by her tormentors would be preserved with metadata that established time, location, and authenticity beyond any reasonable doubt. Brandon's approach to the confrontation revealed someone whose sense of entitlement and immunity from consequences had grown into dangerous overconfidence that led him to articulate criminal intentions with precision that would provide prosecutors with overwhelming evidence of premeditation and conspiracy. His recorded statements during the approach to the storage room demonstrated criminal intent that could not be dismissed as teenage mischief or misunderstanding. Tyler's contributions to the pre-confrontation conversation showcased the political manipulation skills he had inherited from his family, but his overconfidence led him to explain their harassment strategy and objectives with detail that provided federal investigators with evidence of systematic civil rights violations that had been coordinated over extended periods while being protected by institutional corruption and administrative indifference. Austin's role in the final approach involved the same financial intimidation tactics he had perfected throughout the harassment campaign, but escalated to include explicit threats against Emma's family's economic security that constituted criminal extortion under both state and federal law. His recorded statements about his father's ability to destroy the Rodriguez family's financial stability provided evidence of conspiracy that extended beyond individual harassment to include adult participation in criminal activity. The coordination between the three perpetrators during their approach to the storage room revealed planning and communication that elevated their behavior from bullying to criminal conspiracy requiring prosecution under federal civil rights statutes. Their recorded discussion of how long Emma would remain imprisoned and what psychological impact the experience was designed to achieve provided evidence of premeditation that would ensure felony convictions regardless of their family's political influence. Emma's responses during the confrontation demonstrated strategic communication skills that encouraged her tormentors to articulate their criminal intentions while avoiding provocation that might compromise the legal admissibility of evidence collected during their conversation. Her apparent fear and vulnerability motivated them to elaborate on their plans and motivations, creating comprehensive recordings that would provide prosecutors with everything necessary for successful prosecution. The moment when Brandon, Tyler, and Austin physically forced Emma into the storage room represented the transition from harassment to felony criminal behavior that would trigger immediate law enforcement intervention and adult prosecution regardless of their status as minors. Their decision to imprison her transformed their systematic campaign into crimes that could not be dismissed through administrative discipline or family influence with local officials. The psychological dynamics revealed during the final moments before imprisonment demonstrated perpetrators whose sense of entitlement had evolved into criminal overconfidence that led them to document their own guilt through statements and actions that provided prosecutors with ironclad evidence of conspiracy, premeditation, and criminal intent. Their belief in their immunity from consequences became their greatest vulnerability as they incriminated themselves while celebrating their apparent victory. Emma's experience of being forced into the storage room represented the culmination of months of strategic preparation that had transformed her from victim to investigator, from powerless target to federal witness whose evidence would expose institutional corruption and systematic civil rights violations that had operated under protection of local political influence for decades. The sound of the storage room door slamming shut marked the end of Brandon, Tyler, and Austin's criminal enterprise and the beginning of law enforcement intervention that would expose corruption throughout Riverside Falls' power structure while ensuring justice for Emma and protection for future victims of systematic harassment and institutional discrimination. Emma's calm response to imprisonment reflected her understanding that the apparent victory her tormentors were celebrating outside the storage room was actually their final criminal act, before facing prosecution that would destroy their sense of immunity and privilege forever. She knew that justice was finally within reach through federal law enforcement intervention that would hold criminal behavior accountable regardless of family wealth, political influence, or local corruption that had protected privileged perpetrators while denying constitutional rights to working-class victims. The evidence collected during the final confrontation would provide the foundation for criminal prosecutions that would result in federal convictions, civil rights litigation that would transform institutional policies throughout the school district, and court-ordered reforms that would ensure equal protection and educational opportunity for all students regardless of their family's economic or social status. Emma's strategic patience during imprisonment in the storage room demonstrated confidence in her preparation and understanding that rescue was imminent, not through accidental discovery by school personnel, but through coordinated law enforcement response that had been monitoring her location and safety throughout the evidence-gathering operation that would ensure her tormentors faced appropriate consequences for years of criminal behavior that had been protected by institutional corruption. The storage room door burst open with explosive force that sent cleaning supplies cascading across the concrete floor as Police Chief Margaret Rodriguez stepped into the doorway with her service weapon drawn and federal backup streaming through the basement hallway behind her. The tactical lights mounted on their weapons created stark shadows that transformed the familiar school environment into something resembling a crime scene investigation, which was exactly what it had become the moment Brandon Matthews, Tyler Kim, and Austin Perry decided to commit felony false imprisonment against the wrong person's granddaughter. Emma emerged from the storage room with the composed dignity of someone who had never doubted that rescue was coming, her recording equipment still functioning perfectly, and her evidence files automatically uploading to federal servers that would ensure every detail of the harassment campaign and final confrontation was preserved for prosecution. The contrast between her calm confidence and her tormentors' shocked terror created a tableau that perfectly captured the power reversal that was about to reshape every relationship and assumption at Riverside Falls High School. Brandon Matthews stood frozen in the hallway like a deer caught in headlights, his varsity jacket and designer clothes suddenly seeming like costume pieces from a play about privilege and entitlement that had just been canceled forever. The aggressive confidence that had carried him through years of harassment and intimidation evaporated instantly when confronted with armed law enforcement officers who were completely immune to his family's wealth and political influence. For the first time in his 17 years of life, Brandon was facing consequences that couldn't be avoided through phone calls to his father's attorney or donations to political campaigns. Tyler Kim's political sophistication and rhetorical skills proved utterly useless when federal agents began reading him his constitutional rights while placing him in handcuffs that were no different from those used on common criminals, rather than members of influential families. His mother's city council connections and his grandfather's judicial relationships meant nothing to investigators whose jurisdiction extended far beyond local corruption and whose commitment to civil rights enforcement transcended small-town politics. Tyler's understanding of power structures had never included scenarios where federal authority superseded family influence. Austin Perry experienced the complete collapse of his worldview as federal agents seized his cell phone and began questioning him about financial threats that constituted criminal extortion under federal law. His family's banking empire and economic leverage over half the families in Riverside Falls provided no protection against investigators who specialized in cases involving institutional corruption and systematic civil rights violations. The financial intimidation tactics that had been so effective against working-class families were worse than useless against federal prosecutors who viewed economic coercion as evidence of organized criminal activity. Police Chief Margaret Rodriguez approached her granddaughter with the professional demeanor of a law enforcement officer conducting a criminal investigation, but Emma could see the proud satisfaction in her grandmother's eyes as she witnessed the moment when systematic harassment and institutional corruption finally faced consequences that couldn't be avoided through political influence or economic pressure. Margaret had spent 30 years building towards this confrontation with entrenched privilege that had operated above the law for decades. The federal agents who flooded the basement hallway represented multiple agencies with overlapping jurisdiction over civil rights violations, public corruption, and organized criminal activity that had been documented through Emma's evidence-gathering operation. FBI investigators, specializing in hate crimes and institutional discrimination, worked alongside Department of Justice civil rights attorneys who would ensure that systematic harassment faced appropriate federal prosecution rather than local administrative discipline that had proven ineffective in protecting victims. Emma's transformation from apparent victim to federal witness became evident as she began briefing the law enforcement officers with investigative reports that demonstrated comprehensive understanding of criminal conspiracy, institutional corruption, and civil rights violations that extended far beyond individual harassment to encompass systematic denial of constitutional protections to working-class families throughout the Riverside Falls School District and municipal government. The recording equipment that had documented every detail of the final confrontation was examined by federal technicians who confirmed that the audio and video evidence met courtroom standards for admissibility and authenticity. Emma's recordings captured not only the immediate false imprisonment, but also detailed confessions of previous harassment, explicit threats of future violence, and coordination between the perpetrators that established criminal conspiracy requiring prosecution under federal statutes. Brandon's first attempt to invoke his family's influence was met with cold indifference from federal agents who explained that his father's real estate empire and political donations provided no protection against federal civil rights charges that carried mandatory minimum sentences regardless of the defendant's age, family wealth, or local political connections. The Matthews family's assumption that money could solve any problem was about to be tested against federal prosecutors who specialized in cases involving systematic civil rights violations. Tyler's efforts to negotiate his way out of criminal charges through political rhetoric and procedural arguments were dismissed by investigators who had dealt with far more sophisticated corruption cases involving elected officials and judicial figures who possessed actual legal authority rather than inherited influence. His mother's city council position and his family's political network meant nothing to federal prosecutors, whose careers were built on exposing exactly the kind of institutional corruption that had protected the Kim family's interests for decades. Austin's psychological breakdown began immediately when federal agents explained that his family's banking relationships with school district employees and municipal officials constituted evidence of systematic corruption that would trigger comprehensive investigations into financial crimes, money laundering, and racketeering activities that could result in federal seizure of family assets and criminal prosecution of multiple adult family members who had participated in or benefited from the criminal enterprise. The scope of the investigation that Emma's evidence had triggered became apparent as federal agents began questioning school administrators about their relationships with the Matthews, Kim, and Perry families, their knowledge of systematic harassment targeting working-class students, and their participation in administrative decisions that discriminated against families who lacked political influence or economic leverage. Principal Harper, Vice Principal Walsh, and multiple teachers faced questioning about their roles in enabling criminal behavior through institutional indifference and deliberate cover-ups. Emma's detailed documentation of administrative responses to harassment complaints provided federal investigators with evidence of systematic civil rights violations that had been coordinated between wealthy families and school officials who received financial benefits in exchange for protecting certain students while exposing others to criminal victimization. The institutional corruption was so comprehensive and well documented that it warranted investigation by multiple federal agencies with different areas of expertise and jurisdiction. The moment when Brandon, Tyler, and Austin were placed in the back of federal vehicles for transport to detention facilities marked the end of their immunity from consequences and the beginning of criminal prosecution that would expose institutional corruption throughout Riverside Falls while ensuring justice for Emma and protection for future victims of systematic harassment and discrimination. Emma's grandmother, Margaret Rodriguez, experienced profound satisfaction as she watched federal agents arrest the 3 teenagers whose harassment campaign had targeted her granddaughter. But she understood that the arrests represented only the beginning of investigations that would expose decades of corruption and civil rights violations that had operated under protection of local political influence. The criminal cases against Brandon, Tyler, and Austin would provide the foundation for comprehensive reform of institutional practices that had denied constitutional protections to working-class families throughout the community. The federal investigation that Emma had triggered through her courageous evidence gathering would ultimately result in criminal convictions, court-ordered institutional reforms, and civil rights protections that would transform Riverside Falls from a corrupt community where wealth determined justice into an environment where constitutional principles and equal protection under law were enforced regardless of family background or political connections. Part 11. The Complete Revelation. The interrogation rooms at the federal building in Denver became the setting for the complete unraveling of the criminal conspiracy that had operated at Riverside Falls High School for years under the protection of local corruption and institutional indifference. Emma Rodriguez sat across from federal prosecutors and FBI agents. No longer the quiet janitor's daughter who emptied trash cans and cleaned hallways, but a key witness whose evidence had exposed systematic civil rights violations that would trigger the most comprehensive investigation of small-town corruption in Colorado's recent history. The federal agents who debriefed Emma were impressed by the sophistication and comprehensiveness of her evidence collection, which demonstrated investigative skills that rivaled those of experienced law enforcement officers and provided documentation that met federal courtroom standards for admissibility and authenticity. Her recordings, photographs, financial documents, and witness statements created an ironclad case that would ensure criminal convictions while exposing institutional corruption that extended far beyond individual harassment to encompass systematic denial of constitutional rights to working-class families. Emma's testimony revealed the depth of coordination between the Matthews, Kim, and Perry families in using their economic and political influence to protect their children from consequences, while weaponizing school disciplinary processes against students whose families lacked connections or leverage. The systematic nature of the discrimination violated multiple federal civil rights statutes and warranted investigation by the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, which specialized in cases involving institutional bias and discriminatory enforcement of educational policies. The evidence Emma had gathered included financial records that proved illegal coordination between family donations and administrative decisions, email communications that demonstrated deliberate cover-ups of criminal behavior, and meeting minutes that revealed explicit discussions about protecting certain students while targeting others for enhanced scrutiny based on their family's economic status and political reliability. The documentation was so comprehensive that federal prosecutors had sufficient evidence for racketeering charges that could result in decades of imprisonment for adult participants in the criminal enterprise. Brandon Matthews' interrogation revealed someone whose sense of entitlement and immunity from consequences had been so complete that he had never considered the possibility of facing real legal accountability for his criminal behavior. His initial attempts to dismiss the charges as teenage pranks or misunderstandings were met with federal agents who explained that false imprisonment, criminal conspiracy, and civil rights violations were felonies that carried mandatory minimum sentences regardless of the defendant's age or family wealth. The psychological profile that emerged from Brandon's questioning revealed someone whose identity was entirely constructed around power over others rather than personal achievement or moral principles. His complete inability to understand why his behavior was criminal rather than simply assertive demonstrated the toxic environment created by wealth and privilege that had insulated him from normal social consequences and moral development. Federal psychologists who evaluated Brandon determined that his sense of entitlement represented a form of antisocial personality development that posed ongoing risks to community safety. Tyler Kim's interrogation showcased his political sophistication and rhetorical skills, but his attempts to negotiate reduced charges through cooperation and information about other criminal activities ultimately provided federal investigators with additional evidence of institutional corruption that expanded their investigation to include municipal government, school board operations, and judicial proceedings that had been influenced by family political connections. Tyler's cooperation was motivated by self-preservation rather than genuine remorse, but it provided valuable intelligence about corruption networks that had operated throughout Colorado's smaller communities. The intelligence Tyler provided revealed systematic corruption that extended beyond Riverside Falls to include coordination between wealthy families in multiple communities, who shared strategies for controlling local institutions and protecting their children from consequences for criminal behavior. The network of corruption was so extensive that it warranted investigation by federal organized crime task forces that specialized in cases involving multi-jurisdictional criminal enterprises and racketeering activities. Austin Perry's psychological collapse during interrogation was complete and immediate, as federal agents explained that his family's banking empire was being investigated for money laundering, racketeering, and systematic civil rights violations that could result in federal seizure of all family assets and criminal prosecution of multiple family members who had participated in or benefited from the criminal enterprise. Austin's cooperation provided federal investigators with detailed financial records that proved illegal coordination between economic pressure and institutional decisions that discriminated against working-class families. The financial evidence Austin provided revealed systematic economic coercion that violated federal civil rights laws, racketeering statutes, and anti-corruption regulations that protected democratic institutions from capture by wealthy interests. His family's banking records documented decades of illegal coordination between financial services and political influence that constituted organized criminal activity requiring prosecution under federal racketeering laws. Emma's role as the primary witness in the federal investigation required her to provide detailed testimony about harassment incidents, administrative responses, and institutional failures that had enabled systematic civil rights violations to operate under protection of local corruption. Her testimony was so comprehensive and well-documented that federal prosecutors determined they had sufficient evidence for successful prosecution without requiring testimony from other victims who might be reluctant to cooperate due to fear of retaliation or economic pressure. The scope of criminal charges that resulted from Emma's evidence included federal civil rights violations, criminal conspiracy, racketeering, money laundering, and public corruption charges that could result in decades of imprisonment for adult participants and juvenile detention followed by adult supervision for the teenage perpetrators. The charges were filed in federal court to ensure that local political influence could not interfere with prosecution or sentencing decisions. Federal investigators discovered that the systematic harassment and discrimination documented by Emma represented only a small portion of criminal activity that had been protected by the Matthews-Kim Perry power structure over decades of operation. The investigation expanded to include federal tax evasion, municipal corruption, judicial misconduct, and civil rights violations that affected hundreds of families who had been denied equal protection under law due to their economic status or political reliability. The revelation that Emma Rodriguez was Police Chief Margaret Rodriguez's granddaughter created additional complications for the criminal defendants, as it demonstrated that their harassment campaign had targeted someone with law enforcement connections who possessed the resources and expertise necessary to build federal criminal cases against institutional corruption. Their assumption that Emma was powerless had led them to document their own criminal behavior while providing law enforcement with comprehensive evidence of systematic civil rights violations. The federal investigation that resulted from Emma's evidence gathering ultimately exposed corruption that reached every level of governance in Riverside Falls, from school board operations to municipal government to judicial proceedings that had been influenced by wealthy families who viewed democratic institutions as personal assets rather than public trusts. The investigation would result in criminal convictions, court-ordered reforms, and federal oversight that would transform the community's power structure while ensuring constitutional protections for all residents regardless of their economic status or political connections. Emma's transformation from victim to federal witness represented more than personal justice. It demonstrated that democratic institutions and constitutional protections could be defended by individual citizens who possessed the courage and resources necessary to challenge systematic corruption and civil rights violations. Her evidence-gathering operation had exposed criminal behavior that threatened the constitutional foundations of democratic governance, while proving that even the most entrenched corruption could be defeated through patient preparation and strategic action. The criminal prosecutions that resulted from Emma's investigation would establish legal precedents for federal intervention in cases involving systematic educational discrimination and institutional corruption, providing future victims with legal resources and constitutional protections that would prevent similar criminal enterprises from operating under protection of local political influence or economic leverage. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.